Jews have been storytellers for over 3,000 years.
But what does Jewish storytelling look like today?
I'm Stephen Smith.
And I'm Heather Smith.
Welcome to Our Jewish Story, the podcast where we explore the traditions of Jewish narrative, why capturing contemporary stories matters now more than ever. We also share voices from the Our Jewish Story archive.
Real people, real stories, the full mosaic of Jewish life.
This is Our Jewish Story. So, let's get started. When people ask me what the goal of Our Jewish Story is, and I tell them, well, it's to document the Jewish story, they stare at me blankly like I missed the point somehow. But no, they say, what's the goal? And whose minds are you trying to change? And there it is. The conversation has already pivoted to advocacy and to public education, to the eternal question of how we present ourselves to those who view us with suspicion or hostility. So conditioned are Jews to think about those who hold negative views of us, we find it difficult at times to see the intrinsic value in our own story just for its own sake, because it's special after all. Now, let me be really clear about something. The Jewish story is an extraordinary story and worth telling in its own right. Why should I build an archive of Jewish lives to persuade someone who hates me to hate me less? The bottom line is, I don't care about their view of me. That is not the foundation on which this archive is built, or my identity, for that matter. So before we do anything else to try and counter the wave of misunderstanding and hatred against the Jews in the world, which needs to be done, we also need to be able to step away from the fear that engenders, release the exhausting compulsion to fix everything and everyone, and we need to remember that our story has value independently of what anyone else thinks of it or us. Now, of course, I don't mean the meta story, not Avram and Moses and the great leaders of the Jewish world. Those stories are already well documented and have served us well for several millennia. What I mean is the everyday stories of ordinary Jewish people who are carrying forward their tradition, have made consequential decisions for their own lives. Maybe they've survived disaster. Maybe they've had to rebuild their lives and community. They've raised their families, or they've contributed to societies in ways large and small. These stories, and there are millions of them, have never been systematically collected until now. Don't get me wrong, there are many stories that have been documented, but in this way in which we have a single voice, these stories have only existed in the memories of those who have lived them very often, and then disappearing every day. I've been documenting Holocaust survivors for decades. I know something about the depth and power of first-person testimony, but I've only been documenting the lives of ordinary Jews around the world, people whose lives were not defined by catastrophe, for the last few months. And already, a whole new world has opened up to me. Now, I thought I knew the Jewish world, having spent 35 years in and around the Jewish world and having recently converted to Judaism. I have spent my career in it, but I knew nothing like what I know now. And this new understanding has come just from the first 100 or so interviews that I've been involved in collecting. Every conversation we have reveals something I hadn't even considered. Every person carries a perspective, a unique view on what it means to Jewish that I could not have anticipated. I literally cannot wait to learn from each new interviewee. Now imagine 10,000 such interviews, 100,000, maybe more. The process has 3 stages, and they must happen in this order for this story to be complete. The first is documentation. At Our Jewish Story, we collect with integrity. We capture the unique perspectives and insights of each person with no end product in mind, no agenda, no attempt to shape the the narrative towards some predetermined conclusion. In other words, this is not like a documentary, it's more like documentation. It just matters who they are and what they have to say about who they are. Now, this is harder than it sounds. The temptation is always to collect with a purpose, to gather stories that prove a point, support a narrative, serve an educational goal. But that approach corrupts the archive before it begins. Not that those are in themselves bad ways to collect content, but it filters out the unexpected. It privileges certain voices over others. It imposes our assumptions onto the material, but we want this material to live in its own right. True documentation means listening without knowing in advance what you're listening for. It means trusting that the value will emerge from the collection and conversation itself, and not from our preconceptions about what the collection or the interview itself should contain. Then, and only then, can you go to step 2, curation. Once we've documented, and only then, can we begin to curate. And this is where it gets really interesting. Curation is the science and art of mining the archive for content that is relevant to any given audience. An audience interested in cuisine will have different tastes, pardon the pun, than Talmud scholars. Students will have different interests than war veterans. Educators designing a unit on Jewish migration will need different material than a synagogue preparing young people for high holidays. And this is where knowing your audience matters. If we understand who we're servicing, that is, who we want to talk to, we can curate in ways that meet their needs and interests. The same archive can yield infinite combinations if you have done the documentation right, because there are infinite pathways and collections tailored for specific purposes from the archive as a whole. So the more you have, the better you can curate. Curation only works if the underlying documentation is rich, diverse, and unfiltered. You cannot curate what you didn't collect. You cannot find the unexpected if you only gathered the expected. Third, which follows the first and second steps, is education. With a robust archive and thoughtful curation, we can finally educate. We have enough migration stories so that we can teach about Jewish migration during Jewish American Heritage Month, or explaining why Jews were where they were in the world today, or where they are in the world today. If we have enough stories from Israel, we can introduce students to Israelis of all walks of life with clearly defined learning goals that guide us and help us to curate and present what we have in a meaningful and educational way. If we have enough stories about Jewish practice, we can help young people understand the extraordinary diversity of ways in which Jews live their Judaism. So, far from this not being about education, the educational possibilities become limitless based on the quality of the archive itself. They depend on what comes before, because without the documentation, there's nothing to curate, and without the curation, there's no pathway to education. When I was heading USC Show Foundation and people asked me, what's the purpose of the archive? I would say, well, the main goal is for people to know that over 50,000 survivors of the Shoah told their story. That would puzzle them somewhat because they were looking for some, change the world kind of statement. But that in itself is a world-changing statement. It's indelible. It's powerful. It's enduring. It literally changes the world. And knowing that that archive is there is like a part of our conscience. So too the archive of the Jewish people through our Jewish story. The fact is this, when 50,000 people said, it happened to me and I want the world to know, the world knew in its conscience that they had said that. The same can be true when the Jewish people tells its story. I dedicated more than a decade to growing the audience for that archive of 50,000 testimonies from nearly zero to 20 million visitors a year. So I am interested in audiences. I'm interested in the curation and education, but I learned through that without the foundation of the documentation and the stories to tell, there would have been nothing to curate and nothing to educate with. And so we're starting that process all over again with our Jewish story. For that to happen, we need Jews the world over to have the courage to tell their stories in an open, transparent way, just like the Holocaust survivors did. These are not stories of catastrophe. We will hear those, and they are vital to hear, but they're not the whole picture. We need the stories of ordinary life, the small details, the decisions people made at crossroads that they didn't recognize even was a crossroads until later in their life, the learning journeys that they're still on, what makes them feel Jewish in their core, why it matters to them, what has changed over time. What makes the Jewish world so fascinating is precisely the fact that it's so diverse. The tropes about a worldwide Jewish conspiracy could not be further from the truth, as all Jews know. Jews see the world in remarkably different ways. We are naturally pluralistic, inquisitive, questioning, curious. We do not hold others to our standards, but we do want to contribute to the world as a whole and not dominate it. It's just how Jews are. But you cannot learn this from a pamphlet, or from a public relations campaign, or a website, or a social media feed, all of which are very interesting and valuable, but you can learn it from meeting actual Jews and hearing their actual stories, which is the basis of our Jewish stories. You see, the genius of this archive lies in volume and specificity. That's why everybody needs to participate. It's the voice of the many that the mosaic of the people of the Mosaic tradition will be best experienced and revealed. In other words, it needs the entire mosaic. Imagine you could meet any Jew from anywhere at any time and learn directly from that person. Imagine a student who is in, the Philippines, can sit with a grandmother in Buenos Aires and speak Spanish together. That's what AI will help us with. A researcher in London can hear from a farmer in the Galil. A curious stranger can encounter a chassid from Brooklyn, maybe even a secular Israeli, or a Jew by choice, or a teenager just beginning to figure out what this identity means to him and her in an ever-changing world. We can meet them all, and that is what our Jewish story will enable. And there's no better education than meeting and learning from somebody new. Remember those conversations you've had with fascinating people? They stick with you, right? When you're sitting face to face. So when people ask me, what is the goal? I keep giving the same answer: to document the Jewish story as told by the Jewish people. It's not to change minds, although I hope minds will be changed. Not to win arguments, although I hope we'll be persuasive. Not to defend ourselves against those who wish us harm, although I hope we'll be winsome. The document that we are creating is the document of who we are, for our own sake, because our story is worth telling. Everything else, the curation, the education, the sharing with the wider world, all flows from that foundation. And it begins with a really simple act. One person telling their story, trusting that it matters, because it really does.